Imagine the unimaginable. A young boy declared dead not once, but 3 separate times, miraculously returns to life. When he opens his eyes, he doesn't just bring back a second chance. He brings back a message so profound, so startling, it could only come from a place beyond our earthly existence. A place we all wonder about, a place we hope exists, but seldom hear direct accounts of. This is the story of Landon Whitley, a boy who ventured to the edge of life and death, crossed into the unknown, and returned with an urgent warning. He claims he met Jesus, and what Jesus told him is something you need to hear. If you've ever questioned the existence of an afterlife or wondered what happens when we close our eyes for the last time, this story might hold the answers you've been searching for. Buckle up, because you're about to embark on a journey that defies logic, shatters doubt, and takes you straight into the heart of a divine mystery. Before we dive in, if you want to hear more incredible stories like this that make us question our understanding of life, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. It all began on an ordinary Sunday in 1997. The Whitley family, like many families, cherished their time together on weekends. They had a simple, wholesome routine: a trip to church in the morning, followed by a drive home where they would enjoy lunch and spend the rest of the day relaxing. On this particular Sunday, it seemed like any other. Julie Whitley, a devoted mother, was chatting with her husband Andy as they navigated familiar roads. In the back seat, their young son Landon sat looking out the window, blissfully unaware of the twist of fate that lay just minutes ahead. The sun shone brightly through the car windows, casting a golden light on what was supposed to be a peaceful journey home. As they made their way through the quiet streets, Julie couldn't have imagined that these would be some of the final moments she'd share with her husband. The tranquility of the day, the comfort of routine, and the safety of being together as a family were about to be violently shattered. Without warning, everything changed. In an instant, the calm was pierced by the blaring sirens of an ambulance speeding through an intersection. The Whitleys had no time to react. In a flash, their car was struck with such force that it was sent spinning out of control. The sound of metal crunching, glass shattering, and the force of the impact left Julie disoriented. Everything happened so fast, like a nightmare unfolding in broad daylight. When the car finally came to a stop, silence fell over the scene, broken only by the distant wail of the ambulance sirens, now hauntingly close. When first responders arrived, it was clear that the situation was dire. The wreckage was severe. The car was almost unrecognizable, crushed under the force of the collision. Inside, Andy Whitley had already succumbed to his injuries, his life taken in an instant. Julie was trapped, but miraculously, she was still alive, though badly injured. As the rescuers worked frantically to extract her from the twisted metal, all thoughts turned to the small, limp body of Landon in the back seat. He wasn't breathing. Landon's condition was critical. He was rushed to the nearest hospital as paramedics fought to keep him alive. His pulse was faint, his breathing shallow, signs that his body was slipping away. Despite their best efforts, the unthinkable happened. Landon was declared clinically dead. The medical team tried everything, pushing the limits of their expertise, but there was no response. It seemed like his time on Earth had ended before it had barely begun. Julie, still grappling with her own injuries, was informed of her husband's death. The devastating news hit her like a physical blow, but even in her grief, she couldn't fully process the loss. Her mind kept drifting back to Landon. She clung to the hope that somehow her little boy would survive, even as the doctors told her to prepare for the worst. In the operating room, the battle for Landon's life continued. Twice more he flatlined. Twice more, the doctors declared him dead. And twice more, they managed to bring him back, but just barely. Each time his heart stopped, It seemed like the door to the afterlife opened a little wider. He was teetering on the edge of two worlds, as if he were being pulled back and forth by unseen forces. The medical staff worked tirelessly, their faces a mixture of focus and quiet despair. They were doing everything they could, but the situation looked hopeless. It was as though they were watching a soul slip away despite all their efforts to anchor it to the earth. Julie, overwhelmed with fear and grief, prayed fervently. Her prayers were not just words. They were desperate, guttural cries pleading with God to spare her son's life. In those moments, she could feel her faith being tested like never before. She had already lost her husband. Was she about to lose her only child too? She whispered to herself. Please, God, don't take him from me. Not him too. For the doctors, it was a matter of time. The likelihood of Landon surviving was slim, and if he did survive at all, they feared he would suffer severe brain damage. How could anyone endure being declared dead 3 times without catastrophic consequences? They prepared Julie for what seemed inevitable. If Landon did wake up, he might not be the same boy she once knew. He might be trapped in a shell of his former self, his memories erased, his personality forever altered. Yet despite the grim predictions, Julie refused to give up. In her heart, she believed that her son's spirit was stronger than his frail body. She held on to the sliver of hope that he would return to her, not as a broken version of himself, but as the boy she had always loved. The hours turned into days, and the days into weeks. Landon lay in a coma, unresponsive, connected to machines that kept his body functioning. Julie kept vigil at his bedside, her hand holding his as if her touch alone could pull him back from the abyss. The medical team remained cautious, monitoring his condition closely, but their faces told a story of doubt. They had seen too many cases like this, and the outcome was rarely good. But Landon's story was not like any other. Landon lay in a deep coma, the rhythmic beeps of the machine surrounding him, filling the room with a sterile, mechanical heartbeat. To the doctors, he appeared unconscious, but Landon's spirit was far from dormant. As his body remained lifeless, tethered to tubes and monitors, his consciousness drifted into a realm few have ever experienced and lived to tell. Landon later described it as though he had been lifted from his physical body, leaving behind the sterile hospital bed for a place that words can scarcely describe. He found himself standing in a field of light, a place so serene and otherworldly that it felt like a dream, but with a vividness unlike anything he had ever known. It was as if every sense was amplified. The colors were more vibrant, the sounds were more harmonious, and the feeling of peace was overwhelming. Landon would later struggle to put the experience into words, but he was certain about one thing: he had crossed over into heaven. He remembered seeing roads paved with gold, shining so brightly that they seemed to glow from within. The air was filled with an ethereal glow, not from a sun, but from the place itself. It was as though the very fabric of the environment was made of light and love. And then he saw them, figures bathed in soft, golden light. They were not strangers. These were people he felt a deep connection with, even though he couldn't immediately recognize all of their faces. He realized he was surrounded by family members who had passed away long before he was born. It was a shocking revelation, but it felt completely natural in that moment, as if he had always known them. Among them were 2 small children who greeted him with warm smiles. Landon was puzzled. He couldn't place them, but their presence felt comforting and familiar. It wasn't until much later that he would discover the truth. These were his siblings, lost to miscarriages before he had been born. It was something his parents had never discussed with him, something he had no way of knowing. Yet here they were, greeting him with open arms and pure, unfiltered love. Then he saw a figure unlike any of the others, a figure that seemed to radiate light from within, more brilliant than anything he had seen before. Landon knew immediately who it was, even though he had never seen him in person. It was Jesus. There was no need for introductions. The recognition was instant, and it filled Landon with a sense of awe and reverence. Jesus looked at him, not with judgment, but with an expression of love so profound that it brought Landon to tears. In that moment, every fear, every doubt, every bit of earthly pain seemed to vanish. Jesus didn't speak in the conventional sense. It was as if his words resonated directly within Landon's soul. He conveyed a message that Landon would never forget, a message that would change the course of his life forever. Jesus told him that it wasn't his time yet, that he had a mission to fulfill. He needed to return to earth and spread a message of hope and faith, to let people know that heaven is real, that life continues beyond the grave, and that there is a divine purpose for every single person. Landon felt an overwhelming sense of peace and acceptance. He didn't want to leave. The place he was in felt like the true definition of home. But he understood what he had to do. He knew he needed to go back, even though it meant returning to a world filled with pain and suffering. In a flash, the vision was gone. Landon felt himself being pulled back, as if by an invisible force, tumbling through a tunnel of light and warmth. He opened his eyes slowly, adjusting to the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. He was back. He had returned from a place that many only dream about, a place that millions of people pray to see when their time comes. The doctors and nurses rushed to his side, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. After everything his body had been through, after being declared dead 3 separate times, Landon was awake. And not only was he awake, he was coherent, fully aware, and speaking. As the initial shock wore off, the medical team scrambled to assess his condition. They had expected severe brain damage, a loss of basic functions, or at the very least, memory problems. But Landon defied every grim prediction. He recognized his mother immediately, squeezing her hand with a strength that belied his fragile appearance. Tears streamed down Julia's face as she realized her prayers had been answered. Her son had come back to her, not as a shadow of his former self, but as the boy she knew and loved. It felt like a miracle, one that she couldn't fully comprehend, but was deeply grateful for. Landon began to speak, his voice hoarse from weeks of silence. But the words he uttered were not what anyone expected. He started to recount his experiences, describing in vivid detail the sights and sounds of heaven. He spoke about the golden roads, the angels, and the overwhelming sense of peace. But what shocked his mother the most was when he mentioned meeting his 2 siblings. He described them clearly, their appearances, and even the way they had welcomed him. Julia's heart skipped a beat. She had never told Landon about her miscarriages. It was a painful chapter she had chosen to keep private. How could he possibly know? Yet here he was, speaking about it with a certainty that left her stunned. The doctors were astounded. They had seen many cases of near-death experiences, but nothing like this. Landon's detailed account of people and events he could not have known about left them with more questions than answers. They couldn't explain it scientifically, but it was clear that something extraordinary had happened. For Julie, it was a bittersweet moment. Her son was alive, and his words seemed to carry a message of hope. But the loss of her husband weighed heavily on her heart, a pain that no miracle could erase. In the weeks that followed, Landon's recovery continued to defy medical expectations. He regained his strength faster than anyone had anticipated, and his mind was sharp. Even as his body healed from its injuries, he began to share his story with anyone who would listen, starting with his family, then the doctors, and eventually friends and strangers. He spoke with a conviction that was far beyond his years, as if he had been given wisdom that transcended his earthly experience. Landon's story spread quickly. People came from all over to hear his account of heaven, to ask him questions, to seek comfort in his words. He didn't have all the answers. He was still a child, after all, but he spoke with a calm assurance that brought peace to those who listened. He shared the message Jesus had given him, urging everyone he met to believe, to have faith, and to understand that death is not the end. He told them that heaven is real, and that it is a place filled with love and light, a place where we are reunited with the ones we've lost. For Landon, the experience was both a gift and a burden. He knew he had been given a second chance, a chance to share what he had seen. But it came with the weight of responsibility. He had to live with the knowledge that he had glimpsed a world beyond, a world far more beautiful than our own. Yet he was back here, tasked with spreading a message that many would doubt or dismiss. But he accepted this mission with grace, driven by a sense of purpose that he had never known before. He had seen the face of Jesus, felt the love of heaven, and returned to tell the world. And he would not rest until his story had reached as many people as possible. Landon's return from the brink of death left everyone around him in awe. But it wasn't until he started sharing the message he received from Jesus that the true gravity of his experience became clear. The first time he recounted it, he was still weak, lying in a hospital bed, his voice barely above a whisper. Yet the power behind his words was undeniable. He spoke slowly, choosing each phrase with care, as if he knew the weight they carried. "Jesus told me it wasn't my time," Landon explained, looking directly into his mother's eyes, as if the message was meant for her as much as for anyone else. "He told me I have a mission, that I need to go back and tell people about him. To tell them that heaven is real and that we have a purpose beyond this life." For Julie, hearing her son speak like this was surreal. It was as if she were listening to someone far older, someone who had seen more of the world than any child could. The boy she knew before the accident had been curious, playful, and full of energy. But this Landon had an air of wisdom and solemnity that went beyond his years. It was as if he had been changed at a fundamental level by what he experienced on the other side. Julie couldn't help but wonder why Jesus had chosen her son, why Landon had been given this message, and what it would mean for their lives going forward. As Landon's story spread, the reactions were mixed. Many people were deeply moved, inspired by his miraculous recovery and the message of hope he brought back with him. In a world filled with uncertainty and doubt, his testimony was like a beacon of light. People who had lost loved ones found comfort in his words, clinging to the idea that there truly is a heaven waiting for us, a place where we will be reunited with those we've lost. Churches invited him to speak, and soon he was sharing his story with congregations, community groups, and anyone who would listen. Despite his young age, he spoke with the conviction of someone who had lived a lifetime, his voice filled with a quiet confidence that seemed to come from a place far beyond his own understanding. But not everyone was ready to believe. Skeptics questioned the authenticity of Landon's experience, suggesting that his visions were the result of a brain starved of oxygen, a hallucination created by a traumatized mind. They pointed out the scientific explanations for near-death experiences, citing studies that linked such visions to chemical changes in the brain. For them, the golden roads and angelic figures were nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination desperately trying to make sense of a traumatic event. Yet no matter how many theories were presented, Landon's story never wavered. He didn't argue or try to convince anyone. He simply shared what he had seen, what he had felt, and left it up to others to make their own decisions. Julie found herself caught in a storm of emotions. She was overwhelmed with gratitude for her son's survival, but at the same time, she struggled with a lingering sadness, a hollow ache from the loss of her husband. Andy had been a good man, a loving father, and she couldn't understand why God would take him away while giving Landon back to her. In the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, the questions bubbled up unbidden. Why had God saved her son, but not her husband? Why had he chosen to reveal this message to Landon and not to her? There were no easy answers, and it took everything she had to find a way to reconcile her grief with her faith. Over time, July's perspective began to shift. She realized that her anger and confusion were a natural part of the grieving process, but they didn't have to define her. Landon's words echoed in her mind, especially when he spoke of the overwhelming love and peace he felt in heaven. It was a kind of reassurance she hadn't been able to give herself. Slowly, she started to accept that there might be a plan beyond her understanding, a reason why things had happened the way they did. She found herself praying not just out of desperation, but out of a desire to connect with the divine in a way she hadn't felt before. Landon's experience opened a door in her heart, allowing her to find comfort in the belief that Andy was at peace, in a place of love and light, just as her son had described. Landon's journey was far from over. His recovery was a long and painful process, marked by physical therapy, surgeries, and moments of deep frustration. His body bore the scars of the accident, reminders of the trauma he had endured. Yet he faced these challenges with a kind of quiet determination. He seemed to carry within him a strength that went beyond physical resilience, a strength rooted in the experience he had in the afterlife. He never complained about the pain or the difficulty of his recovery. Instead, he focused on the mission he had been given, using every opportunity to share his story and spread the message of hope and faith he believed was his duty to deliver. As the years went by, Landon continued to speak publicly, sharing his testimony with larger and larger audiences. He was no longer just a boy who had survived a horrific accident. He had become a messenger, a symbol of something greater than himself. He traveled to churches, schools, and conferences, often standing before hundreds, even thousands of people, recounting his experience with a humility and sincerity that touched the hearts of everyone who heard him. He spoke not only about the beauty of heaven, but also about the love he felt from Jesus, a love so pure and unconditional that it brought tears to his eyes every time he described it. For many, Landon's story became a source of comfort and inspiration. People who had lost loved ones found solace in his words, taking them as a sign that their departed were safe and happy in the afterlife. Skeptics, too, found themselves questioning their disbelief, moved by the sincerity of his testimony. It was impossible to ignore the profound impact he had on those who heard him speak. He had a way of connecting with people on a deep emotional level, as if he were tapping into a universal longing for proof of something beyond this world, something more than the everyday struggles we all face. Julie watched her son with a mixture of pride and amazement. She had always known he was special, but she never could have imagined the path his life would take. She saw how his message brought healing to others, how it gave them hope, and helped them find their faith again. In a way, it helped her heal too. Every time she listened to Landon speak, she felt a little bit of her own sorrow lift, replaced by a growing sense of peace. It was as if she was seeing the bigger picture unfold before her eyes, a divine tapestry where every thread had a purpose, even the painful ones. Landon knew that his life had been forever changed by his experience, and he embraced that change wholeheartedly. He understood that his mission wasn't just about telling people what he had seen. It was about living in a way that reflected the love and light he had experienced in heaven. He made it his goal to help others find their way back to their faith, to remind them that there is always hope, even in the darkest of times. He saw himself as a bridge between two worlds, carrying a message of reassurance and love from one to the other. And he knew that as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would keep telling his story, fulfilling the mission Jesus had given him on that day in heaven. In the end, Landon's story was not just about a boy who came back from the dead. It was about a message that transcends time and space, a message that speaks to the heart of what it means to be human. It's a reminder that we're all part of something bigger, that our lives have meaning beyond what we can see or understand. And for those who hear Landon's words and take them to heart, it's a message that can transform the way they look at life, death, and everything in between.